I'm a nervous Nelly, so hold on. I go to profile. We did it. We're live. Hey,
Great.
Hold on now. Let me just get back to like, hey man, so good to spend time with you. Thank you very much for doing this.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Adam.
It's going to be fun, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm looking forward to it also. So can you begin actually just by introducing yourself? Would that be all right? And giving a little bit of your own background before I kind of start the interrogation?
Sure. Yeah, just very briefly, I'm something of a refugee from academia. I'm a student of mathematics and political theory. I was very briefly a professor at Duke University, where I gained a certain degree of notoriety by being the only non-tenured full-time academic in the country to have publicly endorsed then candidate for President Donald Trump. I went from there to Washington, D.C., where I worked as a speechwriter and policy aide in the White House for Mr. Donald J. Trump. I exited the White House in a somewhat public and spectacular fashion. And since then, I've established quite an engaging career as a Twitter commentator. So I've enjoyed establishing my presence on Twitter, among other things.
No, well, okay, interesting. So before we even begin, because I got a whole bunch of questions I wrote down, they're right over here. Do you think that compromised your career, looking back now that you endorsed Trump?
Oh, of course. I mean, it closed opportunities, but it opened some up. I understood full well that supporting Trump publicly as an academic amounted to effectively a performative resignation letter from the profession. And so, I was entirely comfortable with that. In fact, I didn't do a good enough job. I was expecting to get protests and things like that, but actually the Duke students were quite good about it. It was, other faculty members who had trouble with it. I did get some threats and so forth, but the students themselves were, at Duke at least, are more interested in, being wealthy and good looking and partying than, being scandalized about, political trivialities. So actually I managed to outmaneuver any protests, somewhat to my disappointment, but I made up for the lost time after my tenure in the White House and was able to generate a certain degree of national controversy.
Yeah, so it's interesting. That's actually one of the ways that I kind of found out about you. So it's weird the way things work out, right?
Yeah.
Because we were discussing this a few days ago. And by the way, I'm going to skip around a little bit because when we were discussing it a few days ago, I showed you my log, right? I showed you my COVID log.
Yes, you did.
Tell me about it. Is that awesome? Just yes or no? Awesome.
Overwhelmed.
It is.
Yeah.
I actually have a professional science writer who's actually helping me stitch everything together now. So the timeline, it's also beautiful. And then I'm going to hire somebody else to cross-index it.
No, it's fantastic. No, it's fantastic. Look, I tweeted recently regarding COVID. It's perhaps the greatest crime against humanity except for war or genocide.
Yeah.
It's one of the great crimes against humanity. And I think because the crime is of such a magnitude, people really have difficulty comprehending it and actually don't want to, because I think the ordinary person's operating system does really not want to fully process how evil and corrupt the people are who run this country.
Well, it's not just the country, it's the world, right? So that's one of the things, and I don't want to talk about me because I always talk about me, right?
Yeah.
But that's one of the reasons that I'm keeping this log is, I have so much familiarity with the operating systems within China in as it regards certain things. And I saw what was happening there. I saw what was happening here. And it was almost, given that we operate in different people operating systems, they look very similar, right? So over there, because it's such a coercive government that resorts to violence like that, right? Like we have a whole bunch of steps that have to be accomplished before they'll come over and hit you on the head. While
Well,
in China,
in theory, yeah.
yeah, in theory, I think that part's going to get worse. Actually, I think we're going to have more violence going forward.
Of course, no, it's of course we're going to have more violence because the people who control this country want it to happen.
Yeah,
and we don't want to get so far ahead of ourselves. So stop me if it is premature. But as you know, I've stated elsewhere, and I'll state it again, like people looking at all these riots, the Antifa, Black Lives Matter, whatever you want to call it, these are not organizations challenging the power structure in the country. These are instruments of the power structure. This is a paramilitary force operating for a specific purpose, and it's being allowed to happen. When you see what happens when the authorities want to go after someone, just ask someone like Julian Assange what it's like when the authorities are actually after you. It's very clear to me, just looking at the empirical reality, that they're going easy on these rioters, and there's no serious intent to stop it. Because if there were, they would make an example out of the handful of the most egregious cases, and they would round up the 10 chief organizers of it and lock them up. But they're not doing that. So I just don't get any sense that the actual power structure of the country, ruling class, is really interested in stopping it. In fact, quite the contrary. I think these riots, which may intensify in the coming months, are actually kind of deliberate, and the rioters are acting as instruments of a broad swath of the ruling class in this country.
Yeah, I think the riots are going to get a lot worse. I think regardless of who wins, they have to get worse, because the riots kind of accomplish getting whoever they want elected and acting as a distraction. But then what comes next to fund all these things that they're rolling out is going to be really unpleasant for the middle class and for the lower economic classes. One thing I've noticed is that news is so siloed that Americans don't know the destructive qualities of value-added tax or GST. It's a different system in each of the countries because it's got a lot of tweaks to it. But Americans are welcoming VAT tax and all the additional taxes that go on its periphery. And there's going to be a lot of riots. There were riots about it in Germany. There were riots about it in Greece. So in order to kind of dilute them a little bit and distract, there has to be some much louder people yelling on the other side of the street. So I think it's a good distraction. I mean, I don't pay too much attention to it, but I hide out in my house. Right? Mm-hmm. Nancy and I will buy groceries for a year and just stay here until it blows over a little bit.
Yeah.
And then, so initially I kind of discovered you because I guess about 3 years ago, because I'm a liberal. I think everybody kind of knows that, right? And a New York liberal, which is cool. And I wanted to learn more kind of academically about the definitions of conservative, progressive, left, right, because clearly everything was getting mutated, right? So I don't know the etymology of conservative, right? So I don't know how it's mutated, nor could I really do the same thing with liberal, right? Because the liberal that I remember from 20 years ago was against war and against the roll up of power. And now I'm 54 and I'm like, something happened. Do you have what definitions do you use for conservative, for neoconservative, for progressive?
Yeah, I mean, I think these things are, fairly unhelpful labels. I don't think you get really much out of it. At least in terms of coherent ideological content, I think there's a certain sociology that pertains to which types of people self-identify according to these labels. But in terms of, going further than that and ascribing any kind of real coherent or relevant ideology, I think that's really not, how it works. They're kind of artificial labels that are used to kind of organize people when really I think the reality is somewhat different, and I would probably prefer like a sociological approach than a kind of ideological approach. If you want to actually get a sense of how things really function.
Well, so when people describe themselves as conservatives,
yeah,
how do they kind of qualify that to themselves? Like, what is that identity? Is that a Reagan identity, or within their own explanation to themselves? What is it?
I mean, it depends on the person again. So you have to look at the sociology. Like one way I might just, break it down as a kind of preliminary basis is, if a young person's calling themselves conservative, that probably means that, maybe they're from Hillsdale and they want a job at like, Kevin McCarthy's office or something. Like it's a very kind of professional term, and any young person who would use it, I would hope, would be using it while slightly cringing and for some kind of cynical professional purpose. There are older people who genuinely kind of ascribe to the term, and I have full respect for them, but they're just kind of, their software is not updated. And, I think that, there is something to the kind of Cold War conservatism of Reagan, like, free markets combined with, robust social policy and certain degree of social conservatism informed by, the typical culture war issues. And so a lot of older people still kind of resonate with that label. But really, if you look at the situation on the ground, as it were, this is like this horse has been beaten so hard. I feel so even repetitive saying it for the first time here, that what are you actually conserving? And I think there have been two major developments that I think is relevant to this question. First of all, conservatives generally tend to identify with kind of authoritative power structures. And I see one thing that, for instance, Tucker Carlson has done well in his show, but others have done too, is just say, wait a minute, these big corporate conglomerates that kind of get away with murder under the label of, being free market capitalists, these people are not your friends. These people are actually your enemies. They're the enemies of the country. And there's nothing conservative about kind of, slavishly endorsing corporations just because, like, in some ultra technical sense, they happen to be, an American corporation. They're a behemoth corporation destroying the country. It's nothing, conservative about supporting them. And a new thing that I think is even more difficult and delicate that we've seen, like if you look at these, riots closely, you look at the phenomenon under the Trump presidency, you've seen that, these organizations that used to be considered like cut and dry, like these are the authority, these are the G-men, these are the people you look up to and support if you're conservative, like the FBI, like, the intelligence agencies, like the government, like all that. And people are, with varying degrees of resistance, starting to realize all of these organizations hate you too. And they hate you just as much as the corporations that you used to worship under the false label of the free market. FBI corrupt, CIA corrupt, State Department corrupt. All of these organizations are corrupt and hate you even more than any foreign adversary hates you. And by you, I mean just ordinary American people trying to get by on an honest living. So is it conservative to support these organizations, to support these representatives of the FBI who are either literally or metaphorically taking a knee to Black Lives Matter? I mean, so it's like, I feel bad for the people who've traditionally identified with the term, because really, like, the pointed question of what is there left to conserve, like if you really honestly look at that question directly in the face, it's deeply tragic and sad. And most people, I don't think, have the psychological fortitude to really process that truth. So they cling to these old anachronistic labels that give some kind of semblance of hope. And I don't want to condescend to those people. I love those people and want to, protect their interests and support their interests. But I think that, you really have to update these labels. The reality that exists now simply cannot be captured by these labels. If the reality could ever be captured by them, they serve far more to obfuscate than they do to clarify what's really important about what's going on today. So I kind of, the number one point about those labels is that, I think they're unhelpful and should be kind of rejected.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, but then I'm going to ask you the same question on the flip side, right? So how would you define a progressive? I mean, I can give you my definition, all right? And it's interesting because I'm in New York City and I know every politician that's out here and I get all the emails and I get all the texts, but also I've got all their texts, like, we text. So, I know a lot of people that are running for this coming cycle. They're going to be running for mayor and running for a lot of councils, seats that are opening up next year. In 2021, there's going to be a big rotation over a big new cycle in New York. And everybody describes themselves as a progressive. And it means nothing. And it's interesting because I'm actually even thinking about running for office myself, not for mayor. I've got friends that are running for mayor, but in a local spot, just so I can challenge them, whoever my opponent, right? Whoever my adversary is.
Right.
Just so I can challenge them to kind of disclose a little bit about what they mean by a progressive. Nobody ever challenges these people what they mean by it, because when you put the sum of all of it together, it's wacky. I mean, there's a lot of things. And I have a company in Europe and a few companies there and throughout that are where carbon taxes and green taxes and a whole bunch of other type of things actually have an impact, and we've got to qualify. It depends on where we're going to domicile the company. It gets a little bit complicated, but I've actually looked at some of the taxes that they have in Germany and in Europe, and that's not progressive. I think it's really hard for somebody to kind of take a look at the Green New Deal and then kind of correspond with anything that's like, good for humankind, because it's brutal.
Yeah, I mean, progressive is another term that I think is just totally misleading and kind of worthless. Like, you just cut away all of these, kind of pointless labels. I think at this point, it's like, what matters? What's your stance on these criminal COVID lockdowns, and what's your stance on these riots? That's all that matters. Like, forget about these labels. I think, you can be very simple. What's your stance on the COVID lockdowns that have destroyed? It's just the death nail into the heart of the already suffering middle class in this country. The death nail to the middle class. What's your stance on that? And what's your stance on these disgusting riots that are being allowed to happen?
But those are two.
All the other labels, they're just a distraction. They can be fun. They can be cute. Politically speaking, when you cut through all the crap, what matters is, what's your stance on the lockdowns? What's your stance on the riots?
But there's a lot of nuance, because I know a little bit about the lockdowns and about everything on its kind of the ancillary to it. There's a lot of nuance to it, though, because on one hand, there is a virus, obviously, and on the other hand, you've got places like New York and California and Germany that really acted as accelerants, right, to push it out, to kind of propagate it out really with a tremendous force. And then, there's just so many different dynamics to it. And then one of them is most people, and I go through this all the time, so I don't even understand. It gets really complex, but just don't understand the way all the testing works, even with, what's called HCQ. So, it's very difficult to ask a person which side of the fence they're on about.
Well, I mean, let me try to cut through some of the nuance, because of course there are 1,000 different rabbit holes one could run down if one wanted to be, the comprehensive chronicler of the COVID period in humanity's history. But I think just from a political standpoint, it's actually not terribly nuanced at all. The question is, if you drill down to the fact, what is the average age of COVID death in this country? It's 79, which is higher than the average life expectancy in this country. So it's not even like this the paradigmatic case of the influenza epidemic in 1918, where the average age of death was something like 28. They didn't shut down an overwhelming portion of the world economy to protect the population from the 1918 flu, whose average age victim was 28. And yet COVID, the average age of the COVID death exceeds the average life expectancy. And you have, up to this point, more people having perished from obesity, from bowel cancer, from a host of other ailments that have perished from COVID. And yet somehow, because this COVID is, we have to uniquely suspend human sanity, human judgment, and impose these unprecedented lockdowns on the economy, which are not even efficiently targeted to protect the vulnerable populations.
Did you feel this way initially? Did you feel this way in January, February, March, or when did you kind of?
No, I didn't feel that way because I didn't know what it was. I saw these videos coming out of China of people just spontaneously dropping down in the street. And I didn't know what the hell it was, and nobody did. And then, when it started coming here, you have to, as for a virus, it's not like, smoking deaths and so forth. Taleb, I think he had a point when it came to the tail risk, which means that, okay, if not an overwhelming people of dying now, but the worst case is so bad, we have to take it seriously in its initial stages. And it made sense to me early on that, okay, we need to flatten the curve to protect, hospitals from running into overcapacity. But then at a certain point, maybe, April or even late May, it became clear that that's not what this was. Quite the contrary, hospitals weren't running into overcapacity.
But when did you go from, were you ever kind of, pro-lockdown?
I was pro-lockdown as a matter of precaution in, say, early March.
Okay, so when did you become anti-lockdown?
I became anti-lockdown once it was clear to me that this wasn't actually this kind of existential threat, which it would have to be to correspond to the measures that were taken to correct it. And I think that occurred somewhere around early April to me.
Okay, so early April is when the HC, and I don't want to talk about this anymore. I want to change the subject because we got off on a tangent, my fault. But just so you know, early April is when Trump said something about it being a possible cure. I don't want to go over his exact words. Then early April is when that guy drank his fish pond or whatever he did with it. And then early April, I think April 12th or April 14th, is when Rita Hanks came out and said that she tried using HCQ and she felt like she was dying. Her bones felt brittle. And after all she endured, she's not even sure did anything to save her life. And she recommends, just so you know, she recommends against it. It's the whole thing.
It's all ridiculous. Like, whatever the point is, when did you realize it was, obviously the virus is not a hoax, but when did you realize that the lockdowns were insanely disproportionate in a way that constitutes a crime against humanity? And irrespective of when one comes to that realization, I think the relevant point right now, because we are in the here and now, is that this thing is a giant crime against humanity. The idea that we're locking down and shutting down massive portions of the economy for this, it makes zero sense as a public health issue. It's all about what you talk about. It's an unprecedented roll-up of power. It's optimally designed to destroy people's collective mental health, to destroy people's ability to relate to one another as humans, having to wear this, ridiculous mask and all these things. It is so deeply evil. And there's so many anecdotal cases of, the older people, God bless the older people, but a lot of the older people do not consume the news with the same type of critical attention that perhaps younger people have become accustomed to. And old people are just terrified of all these stories. They're being barraged every single second by this dangerous COVID. And what they're doing is, I've talked to this anecdotally, I've talked to older people with real ailments who are not going to the doctor because they're scared of getting COVID going to the doctor. So how many people are dying because they're not getting medical attention they need due to an exaggerated concern for contracting COVID? Furthermore, there are so many cases of older people that are so paranoid. First of all, this has destroyed economic prospects for the younger generation. So you have young people who have been blown out of a job, laid off due to COVID, who are now stuck in their parents' homes, and their parents are watching the news all day and terrified of COVID, and they're so terrified they won't let their child leave the house. And so, like, just imagine, like, all of the downstream effects from these, every type of anecdotal case you can imagine. It's so evil, so disgusting, and it's so optimally tailored to destroy people's mental health. And that's what's happening. So I think, we're getting to the point where the best act of resistance to what's going on is simply staying sane, because things are crazy. And, ordinary people, they should be able to live ordinary lives. They're not psychologically equipped to process what's going on. And, the COVID thing would be bad enough, being told every single day that, you're not allowed to leave the house. Oh, now maybe you are allowed to leave the house, but you have to wear goggles and you have to wear a mask. Forget that we told you before that you weren't supposed to wear a mask. Now you're supposed to wear a mask, stand 6 feet away from people, do this, do that. It's this game of Simon Says, but it's really like Fauci says now, and he changes his mind every second. And so you have this thing, and then right after this, they're saying, well, I know we told you not to get out. I know you told you to stand 6 feet away from, your father. We know he said that, you can't have a funeral of more than 10 people, even though you loved your father. I'm sorry, but there's this funeral. You can't have more than 10 people. Now, all of a sudden, there's this, video clip of this guy who was drugged out of his mind, who is a criminal, who put a gun to a pregnant woman's belly, and all of a sudden the country is expected to go into convulsions over this, and the laws, the public health laws of viral transmission are uniquely suspended to accommodate this collective act of worship for this violent, drug-addled criminal who stuck a gun to a pregnant woman's belly, who's now supposed to be a national hero. That's why people call this a clown country. This is not a serious country anymore. It's a joke.
Well, don't be so harsh, though, because a lot of these things I look at them, I don't really pay too much attention to this stuff, right? So I really try and kind of.
Sorry, I'm just getting riled up. I didn't.
No, don't. I get riled up sometimes too, but I like observing, right? Because oligarchs, and I've known some, right? And oligarchs do oligarch things, and it's unfortunate for me because sometimes when I venture to be nostalgic, I get upset, right? Mm-hmm. When I try and reminisce a little bit, even about 10 years ago, I get a little bit upset. And when I try and kind of forecast what it's going to look like going forward and how I can be on the right side of the tracks, I guess, how I can assure that I don't suffer whatever's going on in the future, I do feel like we're going to be leaving a lot of people behind.
Yeah.
And there are some parts that it just upsets me so much when I see the quality of our education going down so much. I know that they cannot be competitive in the workforce. Everyone knows I'm big in the Space Force. You're not going to get on. You're not going to be a participant without having a full, robust language, nuances, social skills, STEM. I mean, there's just so much. So but don't get too upset because there is a lot of this is going to change going forward, I think. So I think should Biden win, the protest will get just as large. But the people that you're seeing now that are getting kind of the phalanx and that are getting empowered, they're also going to get pushed aside. That is not a force that can be sustained. So there's still going to be agitators. It's just not going to be those agitators. And then you have another problem is that if you're, and I've had a lot of big companies, right? So if you're a big company, you don't want those people on your payroll. Those people are all going to be 1099 employees. So part of the future that I do kind of not, I think will be unpleasant is that there's going to be a caste system with 1099s versus W-2. A lot of the people that you see protesting today are kind of getting subsidized through unemployment and through other mechanisms and through the activist industry. Once they've effectively displaced all the local governments and done everything that they need to do, they're just going to be pushed aside. So I don't think, that this is going to be a sustained, I don't think this is going to be a very durable, in the way that you're seeing it now expressed through these type of social movements. I think it's just going to become a lot more chaotic. Rather, right now it's still cohesive because they need people to vote, right? It's a big get out the vote campaign. But after this election is over, I don't think there's going to be that cohesive quality. And I think it's just going to be hundreds of insurgents kind of all battling it out and just causing chaos. And it's going to be unfortunate, but don't get too upset about it. I try and,
I like to be passionate.
Yeah, no, passionate is really good. So we're going to change the subject though, because COVID is my thing to get all crazy about, right? So,
your stuff is amazing. Like I follow all of your stuff on COVID, very, very comprehensive.
You haven't seen anything.
Your description of it as the fastest roll up of power is completely accurate.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're chronicling this unusual moment in history.
Yeah, you've got to enjoy it. I worked on Wall Street and I enjoyed being a spectator then and a participant. Back then I was a participant as well. But I was also kind of able to kind of let myself go and kind of observe everything that was going on about me because it's a crazy place. That. And I enjoy watching it, maybe because that kind of relieves me of the burden of being an activist within it. But I enjoy kind of not having that being subjective within it. So I do think it's kind of interesting. I think it's interesting how forcefully it happened, right? I mean, we all knew that there was going to be difficult. We all knew that the Democrats were fraying at the seams and that they were going to have a lot of difficulty kind of reintroducing their straying legacy party voters back into the party, right? We saw that with Obama. So we knew that everywhere Obama went and he said, if you want to continue my legacy, vote for Hillary, they voted for Trump. It was like a guarantee. You could put your bet on it.
Right.
So whatever. So COVID's my thing, right? I've definitely done a good job of it, but it's going to be another year or two. It's going to be another year or two. It's got to be another year or two.
Yeah.
And you saw how comprehensive it is.
Very comprehensive. Yes.
Awesome. It's so good. So I want to get to something we were discussing earlier today. Mm-hmm. But first, I've got a checklist, right?
Perfect.
But then we were discussing what we were both reading about and we both thought it, and then we both honed in on the same article about a color revolution and kind of the operating apparatus within the United States that is going about that same purpose. So first, though, got to lighten it up, is Amazon, yes or no? Amazon, yes or no?
In what sense?
Whatever sense you want. Amazon, yes or no?
In the Sweden sense, yes, but in the ultimate sense, no.
Okay. The correct answer is no. Jeff Bezos, do we like him?
Agent of China.
Perhaps. The answer is also no.
Number one asset of China.
Yeah, it gets worse than him.
Other than Bill Gates.
It gets worse. Yeah, it gets worse. It gets worse. Okay, Dark City. Did you see the movie? Because I talk about it a lot. Did you go see it again?
Sadly, I did not.
You've got to see it. It's all about people's identity. It's remarkable. It's really remarkable. Space Force.
Yes, I'm pro Space Force.
Okay. You know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you so I can check it off my list. Yeah, I even got a checklist here.
All right. All right.
Who is America's greatest actor?
I would have to say, I can't say Fauci, huh? I'll say Tom Cruise.
But you
close second. Fauci is a close second, and Kamala might be third.
Yeah. Oof. So we DM'd, and you were like, Adam, I love Tom Cruise also, but what's the deal with you and Tom Cruise? And what did I say? I said he's American, right?
I really like him. I do like Tom Cruise. I loved Risky Business, was one of my early favorites.
Correct.
And actually, he's, people make fun, but I think he has a powerful presence. Top Gun was an early favorite. I love it. And by the way, I made a little bit of a joke on Twitter, because you see all these politicians, saying, "Oh, look at China. Oh, look at this. Look at China." Well, and one of those kind of zingers has been, oh, well, in the Top Gun remake, the Chinese have so much box office leverage that they're, Maverick is not able to wear a Taiwan, patch. But I pointed out that, and this is not original to me, it comes from a friend, but it's so good that I have to convey it to the wider public. And that is that if it weren't for the Chinese box office leverage, we'd probably have a transsexual James Bond already. So this idea that, those bad, it's the Chinese are the problem, because Maverick can't wear a Taiwan patch. Get real. The poison's coming from here. The poison's coming from the United States. The poison's coming from the people who control Hollywood. Yes, the Chinese have, leverage, and they do stuff that's, distasteful, but at the same time, let's have a sense of proportion here.
I have friends in Taiwan, and we talk about Tom Cruise all the time, and nobody is aggravated about that, because that's like the most insignificant thing. It's like
nobody cares.
China has done other things with their discourse power and what they're trying in Hollywood. There are other things that are definitely significant, but actually, in all fairness, that they have actually respected the Top Gun and Tom Cruise, the franchise of it, because A, this is the last of it, but B, is in most of their movies, like what you've actually observed actually has a real good point, is that in most of their movies, like Terminator, that they, Tencent and all the Bible movies that they fund in America, they take the hero and
Adam, I have to interject. Sorry, my laptop is not highly efficient. It's at a low energy level, so it's low energy, like Jeb, unfortunately, and so I need to find a quick way to plug this in. So if you give me just so we don't go dark here. Sorry.
So I'm going to stop talking about Tom Cruise then.
Okay.
But it did come up because I did want to change the subject a little bit. Darren and I, and when he comes back, we were talking about a color revolution within the United States. And it's something that I noticed very early when Hillary and Bill were both wearing purple. And I think I sent you a picture of that, right? I DM'd you that picture.
Yes.
When Bill, and did you see that picture?
I did. It was very purple, yeah.
As soon as I saw that picture where she's wearing like this, I don't know, like a tuxedo thing she was wearing, right? It was a nice tuxedo. And it was kind of a weird looking outfit. And Bill always looks good, right? I mean, he wore the color flag revolution thing, purple, nicely. With her, it was it kind of beats you over the head. She was like, So I mean, we both read that article. What are your thoughts on the article? It was in the Revolver, George Kent, and kind of the whole
Right, the Revolver.NEWS article, yeah. Yeah, no, I've talked about this elsewhere. It's a very excellent article in Revolver.NEWS that kind of echoes some of the points that I've been trying to develop about, what a color revolution is and how people might understand or contextualize what's been going on with these riots, because it's an extension of the very natural question kind of that was implicit in some of my commentary earlier. It's like, why is the government letting this happen? It's clear that there's some kind of power behind these riots, because the full force of the federal government is clearly not being used to suppress and stop them. And I noticed some curious coincidences, shall we say. There's a coincidence in terms of strategy and tactics. So these color revolutions, for people watching who may not be familiar with the term, color revolution refers to a series of revolutions that have been conducted with the support and kind of really organizational support of certain bureaucracies within the United States government, principally the State Department, but also covert agencies. And they, along with their kind of nexus or constellation of aligned NGOs, non-governmental organizations that they install in these countries, are able to undermine and then sometimes overthrow political targets that they don't like, not using direct violence, not using the regime change model like we saw in Iraq, but using the color revolution model, which consists of agitating the population, usually young people, student groups, women, organizing protests, and there are certain hallmarks of their approach. So front-loading something that in advance generates doubt as to the legitimacy of a future election. And so that's what they were doing, for instance, in Belarus, generating doubt about Lukashenko in advance, saying, oh, he's going to rig it, he's going to do this, he's going to do that. You see it here in the United States now with this weird like mailbox thing that they're suggesting, like, Trump is somehow rigging the election because the post office is, inefficient and antiquated. The post office is basically blockbuster at this point. It's just and for that reason, it's supposed to kind of suggest something ominous about Trump. But what it really is generating doubt in people's minds. So after the fact, people can say, this might not be legitimate, and further agitate these crowds that are associated with the network of NGOs to do peaceful protests, which is actually a term of art. Peaceful protest is a term of art, you see. All of these Atlanticist State Department aligned organizations use peaceful protests as a term of art in relation to Belarus. They've used it as a term of art in Ukraine, probably the most famous color revolution, the Orange Revolution, then later the Maidan protests. Victoria Nuland, who's a principal figure in these color revolutions, took the unusual step of actually going to the protests. And the one thing that she said was, how dare the Ukrainian government crack down on these peaceful protests? So what they do is they generate massive protests and kind of entice the authorities to crack down on the protests, and they use those crackdowns as a pretext to further undermine the legitimacy of their target government. So anyway, I won't get into the whole thing for the sake of brevity. Suffice it to say that what's going on in the United States, and really what's been going on since Trump won the election, has ticked every box in the color revolution playbook. But it gets even more explosive than that, because it's not just a parallelism with respect to the strategies and tactics. It's literally the same people. It's literally the people who are, in the State Department running Europe and Eurasia policy, who are there as color revolution experts, who have been running operations in Ukraine, Belarus, you name it. It's precisely those people who have been the principal players in this coordinated effort to undermine the legitimacy and ultimately overthrow Trump in this attempt to overturn the 2016 election. It's literally the same people. And so in the Revolver.NEWS article that you refer to, it basically encapsulates the argument that I described in the person of George Kent, who is a Never Trump star impeachment witness who, unlike his colleagues that he defended in his testimony, Jovanovich and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and Bill Taylor and all these types who were actually fired on the basis of their testimony against effectively their boss, namely the president. This character, George Kent, despite being a key and star Never Trump witness, wasn't fired like those colleagues he defended. In fact, he was promoted. And the article that you mentioned at Revolver News points out the curious fact that he just happens to head Belarus at the State Department. And his previous employment just happened to include being deputy chief of station in Ukraine and being a so-called deputy political counselor during the Orange Revolution, which is arguably, I would say not arguably, inarguably the most famous and notorious color revolution ever run. And so it can all boil down to the simple formulation. It's the same people and it's the same playbook. They're running the same playbook against Trump, whom they hate, against all of the Eastern European leaders that they hate. Same people, same playbook. The color revolution in the Ukraine was called the Orange Revolution. Now we have Black Lives Matter. So we've gone from Orange Revolution to Black Lives Matter. I formulate it as follows. Black is the new orange.
Oh, that's interesting. My wife loves that show, so that's interesting. I'll have to consider that. But so do they actually want to turn Trump over? Because it seems like
yes.
But they've been able to accomplish so much with him in power just by subverting him and by subterfuge everywhere he goes. So I mean,
that's true, but it would still be much better for him to get rid of him. And I think even more than Trump, like just personally, Trump terrifies them in the sense that I have mixed feelings about Trump. I'm generally a supporter. I think he really needs to win in 2020, or otherwise we're all screwed. And I hope he wins. And I wish he would listen to me more in terms of communication strategy. He's actually very good. It's just some people, in the communication shop, just don't understand how to convey an effective message. Trump's instincts, for all of his, he's not a perfect man. He's a character. He's kind of a great figure in some sense, but he's also very flawed. But whatever one says about him, he does have good instincts when it comes to communication, and unfortunately those instincts can sometimes be superseded by bad advice. But yes, despite wait, just to finish the point, these people, yes, they're able to do a lot even under Trump, but more so than the Trump as a man who it's Trump as a phenomenon that terrifies them. And these Atlanticist groups that I described, the kind of nexus of NGOs, State Departments, so forth, that hate Trump so much, it's a curious thing. You have three events that really come together to constitute the kind of operation landscape for these actors. And that is, number one, the Russian invasion of Crimea, which was very disruptive to these people. I'm not saying it was a good thing. It's disruptive because it all amounts to energy. And as a sophisticated person in finance, I'm sure you understand all of that probably more than I do. But it's largely about energy in that respect. But it wasn't only the Putin's incursion into Crimea. It was also two other events that are sort of the political twin towers from the point of view of this specific faction of the ruling class that I'm describing. And that is Brexit, and the election of Trump. These Atlanticist groups view so-called populism as an existential threat to their power. And they treated those twin populist events as an existential threat on the order, if not more so, than Putin's invasion of Crimea, and then the election of people that they don't approve of in Eastern Europe. And they were very cleverly able to combine those three events, killing three birds with one stone, or at least attempting to do so, by connecting them narratively and saying that Trump and all of these populist movements are basically extensions of Russia, and therefore, de facto, as a narrative matter, all of the energies associated with those populist victories are suspect as disinformation coming from Russia. And they were able to shut down vast swaths of the internet, actually. The whole internet censorship story actually aligns very closely with the interests and the activities of these Atlanticist groups. And you can look at, for instance, the Atlantic Council as a series of events called disinformation events. And disinformation is a term of art effectively used to shut down domestic speech under the pretext of national security. And so there are many components to this. It would require probably several of these periscopes to even begin to do justice to the tip of the iceberg, let alone the whole thing. But I'm trying to just very broadly sketch some of the pieces and gesture toward why these things are so important.
So it's interesting because part of the theory of my histories was, and I reference it a lot, but I enjoy and appreciate history so much, really a lot. And I like kind of recreating not that era into now and trying to kind of fit those puzzles together, but it's very helpful for me to look at alternatives that have happened and how they've played out and, different routes. So one of my takeaways from the Peloponnesian War and everything that played out was in the end, well, I can think of other events also, but in the end, tyrannies always turn inwards. I've always thought about that. I can give you instances there where there was plagues and wells being poisoned and just a whole bunch of intrigues that were, that happened, presumably. And I can think of a lot of other moments in history like that where tyrannies turned inwards. And if I think it was, was it Tiberius who was the general? Was he the Caesar when the Teutoburg Forest during the tragedy within the Teutoburg Forest when they were killed? I think that was Tiberius who was in there. But they were, the Romans learned very quickly that empires should not extend too far sometimes, and they didn't challenge going back in there for well over 100 years. So I do think that tyrannies turn inwards. So I thought that COVID was definitely that final moment for them to just lock everybody up away. And while you're locked up, the world around you is changing. And by the time people are finally released from here, they're really not going to remember the way it was in December. I can guarantee you, they think they will. But in December, let's not forget, you had the killing of Soleimani. Well, going back to October, you had the killing of Soleimani. You had the killing of al-Baghdadi. You had the Iran shooting down their own jets. You had the impeachment hearings. I mean, this is definitely tremendous amount of activity going on in very short bursts. And I think actually we've gotten a little bit of a reprieve. I think right now, over the last few days and going forward for another few days, we've been very fortunate that our minds are kind of being relaxed a little bit, even with this U.S. Postal Service thing. I expect the amplitude I expect in like Spinal Tap where they turn the volume up to 11. I think we're going to go turn it to 11.
Yeah.
How do we resist the color revolutions? How can we get ourselves out of this?
Well, I mean, that's difficult because you need first of all understanding, you need appreciation, you need buy-in, and you need will and strength within the government to stop it. And I don't really think there are any of those things at this point. And so, it's just as one small voice, I've been, trying to kind of construct this narrative. And so far, I've been fairly successful, but, in some ways it's a little bit late. The hour is late. And, they have their ducks in the row, they being kind of the other side, and they have institutional support and buy-in. Just as an example, like, some people thought I was, being critical of Attorney General Barr for, because he in some ways has formal authority and he should be issuing, he should be basically dropping the hammer on these riots, and he should be doing precisely what I was saying, making an example of some of the most egregious rioters and giving the Julian Assange treatment to the organizers of these riots. He's not doing that. And, to a certain extent, there is a justified criticism there because he should be giving it his best. But in the other sense, I can kind of understand why he's not and why he's kind of scared to do it. And that is that he does not have institutional buy-in at the Department of Justice. They're not going to go along with it. Even if he were, prepared to do, the right thing on this, Department of Justice is not going to move along with him. And so it's like you have nominal executive authorities that don't have de facto authority over the executive branch. And that's a very difficult thing. I think, maybe more can be done than has been done, and hindsight is 2020. We are where we are, but ideally, the pieces would have been set in place years ago, directly when Trump came into office. He would have, set up the pieces within the respective bureaucracies, so when stuff like this happens, he could get ahead of it and actually be able to issue commands through the executive branch and expect the bureaucracies to fall in line and implement those commands. That's really difficult, if not impossible, right now. So I think we have to do what we can. We have to be aware of it. We have to shine light on it and to kind of make it as difficult as possible. But the real answer, unfortunately, because we're on such an accelerated and intense timeline, and there's really not time right now, but the only way this stuff can be fixed is on a at least a medium term, if not a long term program. And so it's a very difficult thing. I think there is a path to kind of ultimate success. It's a very narrow path, very small margin of error. But for now, like, hopefully,
so I'll tell you what I think, right?
Okay.
And because I've been in kind of I hate to say been in politics, but it is what it is, right? So and again, I've always enjoyed being kind of an observer because I was never really involved in politics and funding and doing any of this for the money. I didn't need anybody for the business, that is. I didn't need to procure any contracts or anything like that. I was just doing it, out of charity, which is a very important part of my life. So I can say that things have changed significantly. I don't know if they can recover that much, in that I listen to people talk about politics. I see it a lot on Twitter, and I see a lot of reactionary type of stuff on Twitter. I think that over the last, maybe a decade, whatever, is that people's behavior has become so Uberized, where they expect kind of an immediate reaction, that they're going to press a button in politics and immediately this will occur. And they have no pain tolerance for anything that's going to occur while they're waiting for that taxi. So they just want to press a button, and whatever it is delivered to them, which is one of the ways I think that corporations have been able to cede such control, because they're much more oriented towards delivering, quickly, while as political apparatus is designed to be very methodical and slow and deliberative.
Right.
Well, I don't know if people can restore to where we were. Even I don't know if next year people are going to be even able to restore to where we were today, because I fear that the history of where we will be next year will not have a history of where we were today. Everything is just being taken away. It's like as a person walks down a hallway, as they progress down the hallway, the lights, as they progress, the lights behind them shut off, right? And I feel like that's the path we're taking. So, but I have a lot of optimism about it. I just think that we're seeing the people operating system so much change. And I'm not sure how much of politics is going to be left other than a facade. I don't really know why you need Nancy Pelosi anymore or Mitch McConnell. I think that the elites have been very willing to kind of show their cards.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And, correct me if I'm reading too much into this, but, politics at the retail level is kind of largely fake. There's a spectrum, and some politicians have more actual power than others, but really the decisions that kind of really matter aren't really coming from the electoral side. And there, traditionally has been a utility to people thinking that that's maybe more important than it is. That, there's the famous, line from, I guess, the old communist Rosa Luxemburg said, if voting really mattered, they wouldn't let us do it. I mean, that might be too cynical, but there is an element of, the key decisions, the key, the momentum, the broader momentum is not really determined from electoral outcomes as much as people might think. And that part of the utility of elections is kind of giving people the illusion of having some kind of say, and there might be some say on stuff that's distraction, but kind of the larger momentum is being determined elsewhere. And that maybe as a result of this consolidation of power that you've identified, which has occurred in a flash, like an historical flash,
very violent,
and that is related to the COVID thing. At a certain point, once power is consolidated, you no longer need the happy illusions, and you just have brute force. Yeah. And maybe a result of that is just not needing the illusion that a kind of electoral politics represents.
That's what we are right now. That's exactly what we are right now. I speak.
Right.
Well, it's interesting because I do so much studying of this, and I don't really, I don't want to interrogate people about it. I don't want to ask them. When I speak with people, it's very important to me that I'm not trying to challenge them in whether they're, whether they like Trump or don't like Trump or this policy or that policy, because I already know how much, their frontal lobes are being kind of managed elsewhere, right? So I don't want to challenge that, but I do speak with people about their perceptions of government and their perceptions. So I'll speak to them about what do they remember. I'll ask them certain things about their own memory, about certain headlines, what they remember about the headlines, certain kind of, scandalous type of things that have kind of consumed media episodically for the last 3 years, what they remember about Obama's presidency. But what I'm very interested in now is also how eager they are to have megacorps functionally displace sovereignty. They're actually, this is no longer just the insurgencies who are saying, listen, in order to topple the government, we need to align ourselves with a whole 1,000 other insurgencies and bring the whole thing down. We're not doing that. They are eagerly aligning with megacorps. And they think, even the most anarchistic ones, think that this is a strategy that ultimately will allow them then to take down the megacorps also. So they think that it's a domino effect, that they're going to take down the government, and then they're going to be able to somehow leverage all this power that they think that they've perceived that they've acquired and take down the megacorps.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting. And a lot of them I've noticed also, and I've thought a lot about this, have kind of a religious zealotry to them in terms of technology. And I think about other historical characters where I can kind of look at them and say, this is what they remind me of. So sometimes I think of Savonarola. Sometimes I go down the list, but they seem to think of themselves as kind of Galileo. And it makes it even more difficult because there's not a lot of they're very intellectually their intelligence is very horizontal. So I don't think that there's going to be an opportunity to restore to where we were 10 years ago. I don't think that can come back. So I think we have to figure out what is the battles that we can win that ultimately allow the Constitution to be kind of reinstalled. But I can't suffer I can't be that Uberized person also that thinking that just voting this person in or voting that person in is going to do it, or any amount of protest is going to do it. So I'd be happy to get to where we were last year. I think people don't realize how much things have even changed in this last year, even in terms of Bill de Blasio defunding the police by $1 billion and then using taxpayer dollars to write Black Lives Matter. And I can be both sympathetic to something and at the same time be outraged by the political expression of something, which makes it even more aggravating.
Right.
So I'd like, after I've said all that, how do you feel we can kind of bring things back?
I mean, I don't think we can. I think the only way is forward, and it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
I'm not pessimistic though. Just so you know that I'm actually very, very optimistic. I just think things are going to be different, and I'm not particularly nostalgic because if I get nostalgic, then I'm going to get sad and I'm going to get all weepy, and I'm going to remember the good old days when we had things like amendments that really kind of they were kind of codified and were put on paper, and that paper. I'm not happy to let those things go, but I also want to mitigate as much as I can the damage to the future. So I think many people are going to do really, really well in this future. I think we're still going to be a capitalist society. I don't see any threat to our capitalism. How can you when Amazon has gone in the last 3 years of resistance? Amazon has gone from 600 or something to 3,000. It's kind of hard to say that they're suffering a socialist fate. So I think
that's that's the problem with these antiquated terms like capitalism, socialism. Like they completely obfuscate what's happening, which is the enormous power grab by Amazon. Like who cares about a term whether it's capitalist or socialist? It's a deeply destructive development in our society, and that's really all people have to know. Like so these terms like is it capitalist, is it socialist, like who really cares? It's an enormous power grab. It's bad for society. It's bad for a company like Amazon to have this kind of full spectrum, fully vertically integrated, horizontally integrated control where people are basically kept in their homes due to this mind virus. COVID is much more of a mind virus in its in the sense in which it's significant historically than an actual kind of physical virus due to this mind virus and a kind of government response to it. People stuck in their homes, and just sure enough, there's this lovely company that's able to service all of your needs, and you don't even need to step outside of the house. So it's like, again, this is such a new thing. And one of my older pieces that I'm still quite proud of that appeared in all places in the National Review, Understanding Economic Nationalism, makes the point that the capitalism of Goldman Sachs is not the capitalism of the lemonade stand. The capitalism of something like Amazon is not the capitalism of the lemonade stand. It's not the capitalism that's associated with all of these positive characteristics that a lot of these conservatives invest in them. Like, it's associated with a huge power grab, a huge concentration of power, and the idea that the overlords, the feudal overlords, are in some quasi-technical sense a private enterprise rather than a government enterprise is really immaterial. What's material is its effect on people's lives, and that effect is overwhelmingly destructive. And that, I think, is what's relevant. And so I guess I would jump on that as another kind of opportunity to illustrate the point that these old terms, capitalism, socialism, these are for a different century. This is so 20th century, like 20th, first century, we're in a different ballpark, and it's looking actually quite dystopian. I don't mean to be like a pessimist or anything, but I think in order to be a true optimist, you have to embrace what a philosopher called a pessimism of strength. And that means kind of a willingness to digest very difficult and uncomfortable realities. And one of those is that it's going to be a very bumpy ride, and we're in this crazy dystopian scenario. We've been thrust right into it, and it's intensified beyond any frontier of our imagination in the space of 7 months, and it's probably going to get crazier. So we just have to, we just have to prepare ourselves. And like I say, arguably the greatest act of resistance to all this is just maintaining your sanity. Just don't go crazy, and because all of these things are just optimally tailored to making you go insane.
I think it's going to get a lot crazier. I think it's going to get a lot crazier. And I want to be respectful because I see some people, and I want to make sure I have a chance to say hello to some people. But I think it's going to get a lot crazier. And again, I go back to historical references just because it's easy for me to kind of transfer them to today. It's kind of convenient for me to do that, even though it's horrible and I have to twist truth to do it. But I do like to say that spectacles at the Coliseum always got larger. And I think we're still in that mode. And even just when I remind people, and I reminded you of what's happened since October with, al-Baghdadi and Soleimani and Iran shooting down their own planes, and the people it's kind of and I could continue because I've got the whole list, and it's in my timeline. It's kind of remarkable, isn't it, that was only 8 months ago that there was Soleimani and Baghdadi and the impeachment hearings, and then there's just been, I could continue on. So I think no matter who's president, whether it's Trump next term or whether it's Biden, that it's the effect on the streets aren't going to be that much different in terms of the amount of protest. I think maybe it's easier to convene around protesting against Trump, right? It's easy, right? It's already visceral. It's already kind of infiltrated into everybody's media and everything else. But should it be Biden, you'll have 150 different insurgencies all battling each other anyway, because no matter what, if we look at as a guide what's happening in Europe, what's happening in South America, and places I can speak of with some real authority, that there is a lot of dissent that's been completely bottled up, and I would say the dissent has been intubated in itself, and it's all the radicals that are being allowed to go out there. I think there was a protest in Germany just about 2 months ago, maybe a month ago, about the lockdowns, that they were kind of sick of the lockdowns. And then the media, because I record all these things, otherwise I don't care, but the media said it was an ultra-right rally. It was a rally of ultra-right people. I think that's just going to continue. I think it's difficult to win.
Yeah, they're trying to shut it down. I even got, it's amazing. There are a lot of these journalists are really so pathetic, and I actually have to feel sorry for them, because there's this one guy, I even forgot his name. He's so irrelevant. And their job is basically, in a way, it must be a great job, because I think my Twitter is pretty good, but his job is effectively to scour my Twitter to find something that he can take out of context and then write a little, really subliterate, because he went to a very low-ranked school, not as low ranked as Gucher, by the way, which I'm writing, but he went to a very low ranked school, and so he's basically subliterate. He identifies some tweet and he writes a whole hit piece on it. And one of these pieces was actually, it was hilarious. So the New York Times does a bit on some protests in Germany that was anti-lockdown, and they claim that like maybe a handful of like anti-Semites went. You know, I'm Jewish, I'm not an anti-Semite, and they claim that, you know, a number of anti-Semites went to this rally. Maybe that's true, maybe that's not. This is coming from the New York Times. And I called the rally beautiful because it was, you know, a big demonstration against these lockdowns, which, as I've already said, I think is one of the, you know, greatest crimes against humanity. And then on that basis, this guy, the guy from the low-ranked school, he does a write-up on, you know, how I'm celebrating like an anti-Semitic rally. They're using these same tactics because they've already invested so much energy, like so much kind of you know, mimetic baggage into making the terms like racist, anti-Semitic, all these things toxic, that what they need to do to like clamp down on any resistance to the COVID stuff is simply find a way to use those labels that they've already, through, you know, investments of billions and billions of dollars, been able to make toxic, and somehow link those labels to any type of resistance to the COVID lockdowns. And so you're seeing the same thing with, like, you know, the censorship agenda, which is this ridiculous scenario. Like, you know, there've been, a friend just sent to me an article from some news outlet about health experts saying that lower testosterone may or may not offer resistance to COVID. And this is the type of thing mainstream media outlets are promoting. Meanwhile, you know, they're censoring anyone who, you know, raises, you know, a position on COVID that is not sanctioned by whatever the latest narrative is of, you know, for these so-called experts. So it's like they're running the same kind of censorship regime with respect to COVID, and, you know, very, very, very vigorously policing the narratives on that, and kind of building off of the fact that over the past 4 or 5 years, they basically shut down the internet as a vehicle capable of harnessing the energies associated with Trump's victory and Brexit. Again, that ties into these Atlantic types that I described.
I actually watched it before, and I see people, you know, asking questions, so I want to be responsive to them. But I saw them doing that before. I saw it with like Wikipedia and with some other type of things. But I saw, I would say maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I started watching them kind of taking the internet as a mobilizing force and turning it into a demobilizing force.
Oh yeah. No, it's amazing. Like, they're clamping down on any use of the information tools to, for instance, organize. You can't organize anti-lockdown protests, I think, on Facebook. You are allowed to organize Black Lives Matter rally. So it's one of these things that I think people should be deeply concerned, because, you know, the collective, you know, digital tongues of the American citizenry have been ripped out of the mouth completely.
Okay, but I want to take some questions.
Okay.
I see some people.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, but I wanted to say one last thing to that, because I think about this a lot.
Okay.
When, you know, when you're discussing this with people, or when I'm discussing this with people, it's my experience. I don't try and persuade them of this or of that.
Yeah.
I'm much more interested in how their minds are reacting to this kind of endless positive and negative feedback loops.
Right.
I'm very interested in how people are how their minds are not being allowed to restore to equilibrium. You can see it because there's not a lot of rational thought going on. So this is also why I don't expect next year or the year after to be any type of a relief from that kind of burden that they're putting into our frontal lobes. So I don't have as much anger to those people. I don't, I saw a lot of people that I disagreed with writing about COVID, and I knew they were wrong. I knew that their science was wrong. Taleb he doesn't know what he's talking about. He honestly doesn't. I've read his books, but he's very.
No, he doesn't know. Like he's an interesting guy. I do respect some of his stuff, but he's an example. He's an example of somebody. Because we're we're a society that's effectively like, a merchant economic society. And, he was successful as, effectively as a merchant. And because society celebrates because any kind of other like social or cultural structure, there's not enough cohesion to sustain a genuine prestige that is not connected with money. Therefore, somebody like this who's successful, as a merchant, and good for him. He is a good merchant, and he's a decent mathematician, not a great mathematician, but he celebrates it and he tries to overwhelm people with formulas. But he's not a great mathematician. I know great mathematicians. My uncle is a great mathematician. My grandfather was. He's more of a third-rate guy, but he was able to make a lot of money, and because most people don't know any better, and because he is able to effectively, and good for him, he's able to identify a lot of stuff that is, sorry to say it, is bullshit. He's good at identifying the low-hanging fruit bullshit, but on that basis, people assume that he has some kind of genuine wisdom. He doesn't have genuine wisdom. He's able to effectively articulate certain elements of common sense that are not, the standard, crap that's purveyed by a lot of, mainstream academia. But I think people, again, read too much into it because people are so desperate for any semblance of common sense now, because there's been so much money, so much force, so much power invested into denying common sense, that somebody like that with a little bit of money who articulates a number of common sense truths can be hailed as brave and a genius. Like it's a testament to how incredibly low our standards are right now in this degenerate society.
I wrote a lot about that, and it's going to be good when it comes out. So somebody said, Crazy News Cycle said, how did it work out for Medici? And let me tell you, if Nancy were here, and I think she's somewhere in one of the other rooms, I study the Medicis. I mean, literally everything worked out really good. Florence is still standing. So if that's an answer to anybody, Medicis were very kind of benevolent, right? We don't get that from Jeff Bezos.
Yeah, we don't have any Medici. We don't have any Then that's the indictment of our ruling class. We have a ruling class. We don't have elites.
Yeah, I know.
We have a ruling class. We don't have elites. We have what's sometimes referred to as bug men. These people are pathetic. They're deserving of the term ruling class. Anyone who calls them elite doesn't know what they're talking about. Medici is actually a family I have tremendous respect for. They're genuine patrons of the arts. They support beautiful works of excellence and talent, which is what successful, wealthy, dynastic elements should be doing. No, the people like Bezos and these others, and just